One thing that makes video games such a unique medium of both entertainment and art is how they combine so many vastly different elements together to create the whole experience. Of course, you have the source code and game engine and hardware and the sheer level of complexity behind the computations that games run on, but then you also need to consider all this other shit, like music, art, gameplay, level design, atmosphere, sound design, that's a good one. Oh, baby, that's the good stuff. You need to balance the difficulty. Sometimes a frickin' story has to be thrown in there and you need writers. Then you need experienced actors to bring it to life. Puzzles and combat systems, weapon combos, animation. All this stuff needs to click together like magic to make a single video game happen. But perhaps more importantly, any one of these elements can be a point of failure. A game can be hauling ass in just about every category, but then the performance is choppy and nobody can play it, despite it being a well-designed game. Or you can have something like Metroid Dread, where the gameplay, story, performance, and graphics were all top-notch, but people were saying that music and atmosphere were what held the game back from being one of the best in the series. Now, among this long list of stuff you need to consider when making a game, there is one element I don't think gets quite enough attention. Pacing. In my personal opinion, this is one area where there's a lot at stake, because it can easily ravage a game if it's not handled correctly. Because look, if a game isn't doing so hot in the performance department, I personally can deal with it, provided everything else is good. I still loved Breath of the Wild at launch, even when it was sometimes dropping to 4 frames per second. And if a game has a bad story, I could sit through a bad story. Can't say I've never done that before. But if the pacing is bad, that's where I start to get pissed off and can't get through the game. This is a crucial linchpin of any game that needs to be carefully considered by the developers, and it's simply sitting naked upon the world stage, waiting to be analyzed by some fucking nerd. Hey, how you doing? In this video, I'd like to look at a few games and explore how pacing affects their overall design and playability. But to do that, we have to first answer the question, what exactly is pacing? We've all heard our favorite critics and YouTube stars say things like, oh, it has perfect pacing, or, oh, it's a good game but it's held back by poor pacing, or, this sequence drags the pace of the game to a crawl. You know, you hear people throw that word around like a sack of potatoes, but what exactly does it mean? I took it as a holy mission to find out. My quest for knowledge began, well, in my living room, when I was sitting there and I thought to myself, what the fuck is pacing? Like, seriously, what is it? Does anyone actually know what this word means? Well, I played a couple games, wrote a couple notes, and here's where I'm at with my research so far. It turns out when people use the term pacing with respect to a video game, they're always referring to one of two things, so it actually has two definitions. On the one hand, pacing can refer to the game as a whole and the amount of time it allocates to fun stuff versus boring stuff. For example, if I'm playing an action game and 30% of the game is making me read books, you can say the game has poor pacing. If it doesn't dedicate enough of its runtime to the action, players will get bored and stop playing. This also goes for when games have really long and drawn-out tutorials or fetch quests, unskippable cutscenes, grinding, repetitive backtracking, busy work that prevents you from getting to the next idea, all the things where you're spending time doing stuff that doesn't really move the game forward. This is the first definition of pacing. We're gonna get down, dirty, and nerdy and call this definition high-level pacing, because it applies to the game at a high level. You're taking a bird's-eye view of the game, looking at the runtime and saying, hey, how much time am I spending on the good stuff, and how much time am I spending dicking around? Quick example, in Metroid Prime you have to pass through an area called Magmoor Caverns about a dozen times. It's a beloved game, but it is often criticized for the amount of time spent backtracking through this cave. It also has a fetch quest at the end where you have to backtrack through the whole map to find 12 artifacts, which breaks the pace of the game leading up to the final boss. These are high-level pacing issues. They don't affect the moment-to-moment gameplay per se, but the game is allocating way too much of its runtime to this kind of padding, and it breaks the forward momentum. The game would have benefited from being slightly shorter and leaving all of this filler on the cutting room floor. Now, on the other hand, pacing can also be used to describe the moment-to-moment gameplay, more specifically, how frequently the player is interrupted by random bullshit. For example, let's say a game has good high-level pacing. It moves steadily from beginning to end without any long and boring sections that knock the game off course. Well, if every 5 seconds as you're playing the game you get interrupted by some pop-ups or dialogue or mini cutscenes that constantly chop up your experience, the game still has a pacing issue because it doesn't flow naturally as you're playing it. We're gonna call this second definition low-level pacing. This is the monster under the bed, tickling your toes at night. It doesn't refer to the overall runtime of the game exactly, it's more about how frequently the game stops and goes and jerks you around as you're playing it. Ideally, in almost every scenario, a game should never interrupt the player while they're immersed in it. Okay, unless the game is built upon that sort of thing.
Hold up! Wait, what's up with the motherfucker?
But this is rare. Generally speaking, games shouldn't interrupt the player at all. This isn't my opinion, by the way.
That's not an opinion, it's a fact.
Saying games should have very little story is an opinion, because some people like story-driven games and others don't. But saying games should have very few interruptions is a fact, because nobody on Earth likes being interrupted. Our brains have literally evolved to solve problems and focus on tasks, and nobody on the planet enjoys having their attention snapped away from the thing they're focusing on to some other bullshit they don't care about. Nobody. Not a single person, period. So as a rule of thumb, games should avoid this. Going back to the example of Metroid Prime, this would be like, say, scanning things. You can scan parts of the environment to gather information. Now, thankfully, this doesn't present an issue because it's mostly optional and it usually only takes about 2 seconds to do. It looks like this. And then you're rewarded with a little bit of sweet intel, so not too bad. But let's stop and assume that the developers did things a little differently and made it take 6 seconds. And now every time you scan something, it looks like this. In that case, we would have an obvious low-level pacing problem, because every other moment the game is completely stopping for 6 seconds, and I don't think anybody would want to sit through that. These are the two definitions of pacing. Keep them in mind, and let's look at a few games. For our first game, let's go ahead and compare Pikmin 1 with its sequel, Pikmin 2. Why Pikmin, you ask, of all the games I could have picked? Well, because I think these games effectively illustrate the difference pacing makes in the quality of a game. Now, I wouldn't say Pikmin 1 is a perfect game by any stretch, but it does have quite good pacing at both the high and low levels, so let's use it to show what that looks like. The game starts off and Olimar just absolutely eats shit, crashes his ship into a mysterious planet, and then this happens. The music creeps in, he shakes himself off, and you play a little tutorial. It's a short sequence that teaches you the rules and mechanics of the game and gives you a bit of exposition about the premise. You have 30 days to find the 30 missing pieces of Olimar's ship, or his life support will flatline, and he's dead. Once you find the engine and bring that puppy in, tutorial's over. On the second day you head to a new area called the Forest of Hope to gather more parts. After landing and destroying this wall, the game just lets you loose. You've been playing for about 10 minutes at this point, and now you can just get down to business and find the remaining 29 pieces of your ship. The game is well paced across the board. At the high level, it's good because it has a steady forward momentum through each of its main areas. There's basically no padding or redundant time-wasting anything. You just go from the Forest of Hope, to the Forest Navel, to the Distant Spring, to the final stage, and then you beat the game. It's broken into 30 days, and each one is a 13-minute chunk of pure gameplay. You have 100% control over how you strategize and organize your time, so a skilled player can actually complete the game in less than half of the 30 days. The duration of the game is completely driven by the gameplay and the player's decisions, and it's also a fairly short game, which actually works well for the premise. There was no need for this to be some 50 to 60 hour game packed with filler content and grinding. It's more like a cool little tech demo that you can play over and over again to try to optimize your strategy. And since it came bundled with the GameCube, there was no risk of people saying they didn't get what they paid for or anything like that. In terms of low-level pacing, it's also good because within those 13-minute days, you're just playing. When you break that wall in the Forest of Hope and see these enemies, you can just attack them and see what happens. The game doesn't feel the need to constantly interrupt you every 5 seconds to explain how to fight a new enemy, or what this nectar does, or how to best manage your Pikmin, or which area you should go to next. There are a few little interruptions, like how the game snaps your attention back to the ship when the Pikmin bring in a part. So it's not perfect, but for the most part it just lets you play the game, and in doing so it encourages the player to experiment and try new things, which is great. Whether you personally like this game or not, the pacing is good. Alright, now let's hop on over to Pikmin 2. Oh boy. I know a lot of people love this game and consider it a perfect sequel, but in my opinion, major pacing issues bring this game to its knees. The tutorial in the first game takes about 5 minutes. The tutorial in this game takes, well, the entire game, because it literally never stops pausing the action to explain something to you that you probably already figured out yourself. Almost every single in-game day will involve you finding some new thing, like a flower or a Pikmin type or a piece of equipment, and the game will stop so that your ship can explain it to you in agonizing detail. Oh, that geyser's probably the way out. Wow. Well, I'm sure that sound won't get annoying. Okay, what's this? We got some flowers here. That sound again. Woo! That's gotta be the most annoying thing I've ever heard. Alright, boys, let's... Oh! Okay, it's showing me goo. The game is showing me goo. Alright, doing a little bit of harvesting, a little bit of Pikmin throwing. You know how she goes. Oh! Thanks for showing me that. Alright, there's a monster there on the other side. What we're gonna do is break this wall, take him out. Oh my god, really? Holy fuckaroo, man. Who could even sit through this game? I'm literally getting ambushed by a boss right now. Oh my god. Basically, whenever you're invested in anything, the game will jerk your attention away to show you something trivial. This can be forgiven early on when the player needs to learn the basics, but it should never last more than 20 minutes or so, let alone the entire runtime of the game. As you can probably tell based on my brilliant definition back here, this is a low-level pacing issue, but the game does have some issues at the high level as well, because it introduced dungeons that don't fully work out. In the first game, you spend the meat of the game exploring the world, dividing and conquering to gather parts and bring them all back to your ship. In Pikmin 2, you're constantly jumping back and forth between exploring a new area and getting all immersed in that, and then jumping through these dungeon Oh, come on! Jumping through these dungeon floors that feel completely disconnected from the rest of the planet. Some of these dungeons are intriguing, but they present a problem. If I find a ship part or something in the first game, I can throw a bunch of Pikmin at it and they can start marching it back to my ship. While they're doing that, I can take my remaining troops and go do something else. You know? That's kind of the whole point of Pikmin. You're rewarded for thinking strategically and multitasking. There's always something you can do to be more resourceful and efficient and get those ship parts faster. But in the dungeons of Pikmin 2, you often have no choice but to sit and wait around. For example, in this room I find a roll of tape and get a bunch of Pikmin on it, and then off they go. Yep. See, there's nothing else for me to do down here. I can see the exit, but I just have to wait around like a dumbass until they get the tape back to the entrance. These linear dungeon rooms lead to a lot of standing around and break the pace of the game. Yeah, not fun. Because of all of this Class A bullshit, Pikmin 2 is a worse game than Pikmin 1. The frustrating thing is that it should decisively be the better game. It brings so many cool ideas to the table, like suit upgrades, more challenging bosses and fights, no 30-day time limit, a snowy area, which I always love, swappable characters, not to mention the best voice acting of all time.
Oh no. No way.
But it often feels like a chore to play, and if I'm being honest, I still haven't beaten it. I've tried, twice, but getting to the finish line with this one just feels like crawling butt naked across the Rub al Khali desert. With better pacing, this would have been a perfect sequel, but instead it's just a bore.
You know what? I could forgive all of it, if you weren't such a bore. Thanks for the steak.
Alrighty. For our next case study, we'll have to leave Nintendo Land for a bit and take a look at the game series that is by far the most notorious for having the pacing of a dying snail, which is actually made by Ubisoft, and that series is Assassin's Creed. I don't think this is a surprise to anyone. This franchise right here is basically the textbook example of how to ruin a game's potential strictly by not understanding how to pace a video game. If you're one of the people watching this video, you've most likely seen the famous Donkey video where he absolutely tears all of these games apart.
Assassin's Creed sucks enormous gorilla dick.
It's legendary how much this guy hates Assassin's Creed. But if you think about it, all he's really saying, without actually saying it, is the reason he hates Assassin's Creed is because it has really bad pacing.
That's all I ask from these games. Just let me get to the fun part. They're so hesitant, so reluctant to let you just play the fucking game.
Going by the definitions we've established in this video, Assassin's Creed blunders mostly at the high level, because it doesn't allocate enough time to the elements that make the game fun, like chase sequences, doing parkour through cities, combat, stealth, and assassinating your enemies. Despite being both the best parts and the whole point of these games, they often take a backseat to a bad story and bad dialogue that constantly break up the action. There's a disproportionate amount of attention given to cutscenes, flashbacks, tracking missions where you just slowly walk behind some people, sequences where you walk next to somebody and listen to them talk for like 10 minutes, and recycled side missions that feel the same every single time you do them. This leaves many players feeling starved for something actually new and fun to do.
They would rather make an 18-hour game with 4 hours of good material hidden somewhere in there than just an 8-hour game that's consistently good.
This is disappointing because there is actually a lot of good stuff in these games buried beneath the filth. The core gameplay is pretty tight, and I also think the graphics, music, and performance are all flawless. Unlike 90% of the video game industry in Hollywood, the team behind the series seems to be pretty passionate about history, and actually attempt to depict these historical settings with some degree of accuracy, which is really cool to see. They go out to location, do field work, and really do their research, leading to these games being almost more enjoyable as virtual reality history tours where you can see the Lighthouse of Alexandria or the Great Library, than an actual game that you'd want to beat from start to finish. All the good stuff doesn't really matter if the game is boring as shit, which it often becomes by the 50th tracking mission. If that isn't a perfect example of why pacing is one of the most important elements to consider when designing a game, well then I really don't know what is. Alright, and now for the finisher, we'll head back to Nintendo Land to look at a very divisive and polarizing game, The Legend of Zelda: Skyward Sword. For those who don't know, Skyward Sword created a bit of a split among Zelda fans when it was released back in 2011. Shill critics gave it 10 out of 10s across the board, but a majority of players considered it to be a bit subpar compared to previous entries, like Twilight Princess and Wind Waker. Among those who disliked it, I'm sure for many the problem simply came down to the motion controls, as some people just can't stand them, and that's fair as there was no other way to play the game. But in my case, I actually thought the motion controls were super cool at the time, and yet I was having other issues enjoying the game to its fullest. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but now it's completely obvious. Can you guess what that reason was, dear viewer? It was pacing. Yeah, it probably had something to do with the pacing. The main problem was that in its original state, this game crawled along. At the high level, it wasn't too bad, although a fair argument can be made that the intro and tutorial overstay their welcome a bit. But that was pretty common in 3D Zelda games, and it's nice to set up the characters and world before diving in, so no big deal. The game moves forward through its story and areas and dungeons at a steady pace once you clear the intro, and has lots of variety without a big waste of time fetch quest like the Wind Waker had. High level pacing gets a pass. Now, it's those low-level pacing issues, which are really what cranked Skyward Sword's guts open on its original Wii release. The main culprit here is Fi, one of the worst sidekicks in history. This little cockroach never stops interrupting the game. Marimahas, shut the fuck up! Okay? And it's not just Fi, it's everything. Skyward Sword is obsessed with pausing the gameplay every few minutes to show you the most obvious things. Take a look at this example right here. So I'm gonna blow up that breakable wall. Pointless. I'm standing right here. I know it's gonna blow up. There's nowhere else for me to go. You hit the switch. Okay, that one maybe makes sense, I guess, if they needed to freeze gameplay to run that animation. I don't know. Then you blow this thing up. Like, seriously? I'm standing right here. I just threw the bomb into it 2 seconds ago. Besides, isn't that sound supposed to be a treat? A rare treat for when I figure something out? Do you have to stop and show me every single thing I do? You gotta love this. I throw a bomb at an obviously breakable wall, pick up another bomb, then it cuts me off to show me this wall exploding for a weirdly intimate amount of time. Then by the time I regain control, the bomb I'm holding blows up. I think for a lot of players, myself included, the constant stopping and going was enough to drive them up the wall. What's interesting about the case of Skyward Sword is that the developers knew that pacing was actually the biggest issue with the game, and they fixed quite a few of these issues for the remaster on the Switch. That's where I'm capturing this footage, and my god, for those who have never played the original, you simply have no idea how much better this is. I enjoyed the game a lot more on the Switch because when Fi wants to talk to you, your sword lights up and you can just ignore her ass, rather than her just jumping out of nowhere every 3 seconds. It doesn't solve all the issues like the desert situation I just showed, but it is a clear testament to how cleaning up pacing issues can make a subpar game straight up good. I'll dive deeper into this topic in a future video, but for now it's safe to say that pacing issues were the #1 thing making this game inferior to other Zelda games of its kind. Anyways, that's all I'll ramble off on this topic for now, but I want to point out that this video is by no means an exhaustive exploration of what pacing is. There are still a few unsolved mysteries and phenomena worth looking into. For example, there is a case to be made that for a story-driven JRPG like Final Fantasy, then in addition to high-level and low-level pacing, it also has to succeed with its narrative pacing as well, which is a completely different thing. Narrative pacing is what keeps the reader or viewer engaged in a book or TV show or movie, and while this doesn't apply to most video games, it certainly would if the story was an integral part of what makes the game good. I also haven't yet come to a conclusion on how a game like Pokemon is one of the most fun and addicting games ever, even though it breaks the cardinal rule of low-level pacing by interrupting you every 5 seconds with a random encounter. What's interesting here is that I've played tons of Pokemon growing up, and I almost always moaned in agony every time this happened when I didn't want it to. Like, it definitely was kind of annoying. But we just tolerated it because these encounters occur within the context of a game loop and world that's so good, they just got away with it every time. Anyways, those are my thoughts, take them or leave them. Curious to see what you guys think about this topic in the comments. Let me know if I missed any definitions of pacing that you would use. Oh, and before I go, we forgot one pacing analysis. Alright, bye-bye.